There is a sentence Jimmy Carter once said about his marriage that sounds almost impossible to believe. After everything they had been through, after political defeats, presidential pressure, years of public scrutiny, arguments that became so bitter they could barely speak to each other, there was apparently a moment when the marriage itself was no longer guaranteed. Divorce had entered the room, not as a newspaper rumor, not as something invented by political enemies, not as a possibility imagined decades later by biographers. They had actually considered it, and yet they stayed married. For another year, then another, until the years became decades, until the couple who had once struggled to understand each other became one of the most recognizable partnerships in American public life. And eventually, until they had spent more than 77 years married. That is what makes the story of Rosalynn and Jimmy Carter so interesting. Because from the outside, their marriage can look almost effortless. The photographs suggest partnership. The public appearances suggest affection. The political history suggests teamwork. The old interviews suggest two people who had simply figured each other out. But that is not the whole story. The real story is much more uncomfortable. Their marriage was not saved because they never fought. It was not saved because they agreed on everything. It was not saved because Jimmy Carter was always the perfect husband. And it was certainly not saved because Rosalynn simply accepted whatever happened and remained silent. The evidence points towards something much more complicated. She fought him. She challenged him. She disagreed with him. She sometimes refused to speak to him. She told him when she thought he was wrong. And at least once, when the strain became severe enough, divorce became part of the conversation. So why didn't she leave? That question becomes even more fascinating when you understand who Rosalynn Carter was. Because she was not merely the woman standing beside Jimmy Carter. She became one of the most politically influential presidential spouses of the 20th century. She advised him. She campaigned for him. She studied policy. She traveled across the country on his behalf. She became deeply involved in mental health advocacy. And inside their marriage, she gradually transformed from a young woman who followed her husband into a partner who expected to be heard. That transformation began long before anyone knew the name Jimmy Carter, and it began with a marriage that almost immediately demanded more from Rosalynn than she had expected. July 7, 1946, Plains, Georgia. Jimmy Carter married Rosalynn Smith. He was 21. She was 18. And the marriage began with a detail that tells you something important about Rosalynn before the presidency, before the White House, before the campaigns, before the Carter Center. Jimmy had already asked her once. She had said no. Rosalynn had promised her dying father that she would finish college. Jimmy was persistent. Eventually, she changed her mind. Years later, Rosalynn would joke about the beginning of their relationship. Jimmy had supposedly gone home after their first date and told his mother that he had just met the woman he was going to marry. Rosalynn had a much less dramatic explanation. She remembered his Naval Academy uniform. The romance became real quickly. But marriage did not mean the end of uncertainty. It meant the beginning of it. Jimmy was entering the Navy. Rosalynn was entering a life that would be defined by movement. Norfolk, new assignments, long separations, children, new homes, new responsibilities. And very early, Rosalynn discovered something that would become a recurring pattern throughout her life. Jimmy Carter had enormous ambitions, and those ambitions did not always ask permission from the people around him. During their early Navy years, Rosalynn was often alone during the week while Jimmy served aboard ship. She was young. She was far from home. She had a baby, and much of the responsibility fell onto her shoulders. But she adapted. She had to. The young woman who had once been expected to become a wife and mother was learning something else. She was learning that she was capable of running things. That lesson would become crucial. Because in 1953, everything changed. Jimmy's father died. The Navy career that had been carrying the young family toward a very different future suddenly ended. Jimmy decided to return to Georgia and take over the family business. Rosalynn did not want to go. This detail matters, because the popular version of their story often makes it sound as if they simply returned home together and began the next chapter. They did not. Rosalynn was devastated by the decision. She had grown accustomed to Navy life. She had seen places beyond planes. She had developed an identity outside the narrow world she had grown up in. And suddenly, Jimmy had made a decision that would determine both of their lives. They were going back to planes. Rosalynn later described this period as one of the rockiest periods of their marriage. Jimmy remembered how badly she reacted. She was angry. She withdrew. She avoided talking to him. And for a young marriage, this was dangerous. Because there is a difference between having an argument and discovering that the two people inside a marriage may actually want different lives. Jimmy wanted responsibility. Rosalynn wanted independence. Jimmy believed returning home was necessary. Rosalynn felt as if the life she had begun to build had suddenly been taken away. For a while, neither side knew how to solve it. And this is where the story begins to move away from the familiar image of the devoted political wife. Because Rosalynn did not save the marriage by becoming smaller. She saved it by becoming stronger. She found a role. The Carter family had a peanut business. Rosalynn became deeply involved. She learned the finances. She studied the business. She discovered that she understood certain parts of it better than Jimmy did. And something changed. The marriage began to move from hierarchy toward partnership. Jimmy later described the transformation himself. Early in the marriage, he had been the dominant person. That changed. Rosalynn became his equal. In some areas, he believed she was stronger than he was. That distinction is essential. Because when people look at long marriages, they often search for the thing that kept the wife from leaving. But sometimes the better question is, what gave her a reason to stay? For Rosalynn, the answer was not simply love. It was partnership. She was building something with him. And as Jimmy entered politics, that partnership became more powerful. In 1962, Jimmy ran for the Georgia State Senate. Rosalynn learned campaigning. When he ran for governor, she campaigned again. When he ran for president, she became one of his most important political assets. She traveled across the country. She spoke to voters. She carried his message into places he could not reach himself. And eventually, she entered the White House with a role that was very different from the traditional image of a first lady. She did not simply host dinners. She studied issues. She advised the president. She chaired a presidential commission on mental health. She became involved in policy. Jimmy scheduled weekly meetings with her in the Oval Office. He sought her advice. He trusted her judgment, and the woman who once felt that her husband had dragged her back to Georgia was now sitting close enough to the center of American power to influence the president himself. But power did not eliminate marital problems. If anything, it gave them new places to appear. Because Jimmy Carter was an intensely driven man. He wanted to accomplish things. He wanted to understand problems. He wanted to solve them. And Rosalynn had her own ideas about how their life should work. That created friction, and sometimes the friction became serious. There is another chapter in their story that Americans often remember for a completely different reason. 1976, the presidential campaign. Jimmy Carter was trying to convince the country that he was a different kind of politician, a deeply religious man, a man who spoke openly about morality, a man who wanted voters to believe that he was honest about his imperfections. Then came the Playboy interview. Carter spoke openly about lust. He said he had looked at women with lust and had committed adultery in his heart. The words exploded across the country. The political consequences were immediate. His campaign was suddenly forced to explain something that had never been supposed to become the central story of the election. And journalists went to Rosalynn. They wanted to know what she thought. Was she embarrassed? Was she angry? Did she distrust her husband? Her answer was revealing. She said she trusted him. She defended the context of what he had said. and she did not allow the controversy to become a public marital crisis. That moment tells you something important about her. Rosalynn did not believe that protecting a marriage meant pretending nothing difficult had happened. She believed it meant understanding the person you were married to, and that distinction would matter later, because the most revealing evidence about the Carters' marriage did not come from a scandal. It came from something much quieter. A book. In the 1980s, Jimmy and Rosalynn decided to write a book together. It sounded harmless. Two people who had spent decades together. Two people who had shared politics, business, family, religion, and the presidency. Surely they could write one book. They could not. At least not easily. They remembered events differently. They disagreed about what had happened. They disagreed about how those events should be described. And eventually they became so frustrated that they stopped talking to each other about the book. They communicated through messages on their word processors. Think about that. These were two people who had survived political campaigns. They had survived the presidency. They had survived the pressure of the White House. They had survived public criticism. But now they were sitting in the same home and communicating through a computer. One would write. The other would answer. Then the first would respond. The marriage had become a correspondence. And eventually Rosalynn described this period as probably the closest they had ever come to divorce. There it is. The word. Divorce. Not as an abstract concept, not as something that happened to other couples, but as something that had entered their own marriage. So why didn't she leave? Why didn't Jimmy leave? Why did two people who had reached that point decide that the marriage was still worth saving? The answer begins with something neither of them seems to have believed in. Perfection. They did not need a perfect marriage. They needed a marriage they could repair. That is a very different philosophy. A perfect marriage breaks the first time reality arrives. A repairable marriage expects damage. It expects disagreement. It expects anger. It expects misunderstanding. But it also expects the two people to come back. And that became one of the most important habits of the Carters' relationship. They tried to reconcile before going to sleep. They prayed. They read the Bible together. They talked. Sometimes they failed, but they kept returning to the same principle. The argument was temporary. The relationship was larger. That sounds simple. It isn't. Because staying is not always noble. Sometimes staying in a destructive relationship is harmful. Sometimes leaving is the brave decision. So this story should not be reduced to the idea that Rosalynn Carter stayed because a woman was supposed to stay. That would misunderstand her completely. She lived in an era when women were often expected to subordinate themselves to their husbands. But Rosalynn's life moved in the opposite direction. She became more independent, more politically sophisticated, more confident, more publicly influential. She did not stay because she had no alternative. She stayed while becoming more powerful inside the partnership. That distinction changes the entire story. Rosalynn had something to protect. But it was not merely Jimmy's career. It was their shared life, their children, their faith, their work, their history, and, perhaps most importantly, the version of herself she had built inside that marriage. The young Rosalynn, who had once been furious about returning to Plains, was not the same woman who eventually walked into the White House. She had learned how to negotiate. She had learned how to campaign. She had learned how to disagree. She had learned how to make decisions. And she had learned something Jimmy had also learned. The marriage worked better when neither person was trying to dominate it. That lesson had been hard-earned, and it had not always been pretty. In fact, some of their greatest conflicts came from exactly the thing that later made them such an effective team. They were both strong. Two strong people can build something extraordinary together. They can also collide. And the Carters collided. The writing dispute was only one example. There were disagreements over politics, disagreements over memories, disagreements over decisions, disagreements over how their shared story should be told. But there was a recurring pattern. They fought. Then they tried to understand. They did not always reach agreement, but they kept the relationship alive. This is where the title of this story becomes almost misleading. Why did Rosalynn Carter refuse to divorce Jimmy Carter? Because, in the end, there was no single moment when she stood at the door and announced that she had decided to remain. There was no dramatic courthouse scene, no famous speech, no one photograph capturing the instant she chose marriage over divorce. The choice happened repeatedly, in smaller moments. When Jimmy left the Navy, when she was angry, when they disagreed, when political campaigns exhausted them, when the presidency strained their private life, when the Playboy controversy became a national spectacle, when they fought over a book, when they stopped talking, when divorce became imaginable, and then when they talked again. That is what makes long marriages difficult to understand from the outside. We want a single explanation: love, religion, children, duty, habit, fear, money. None of these explanations is enough. For Rosalynn Carter, the marriage became a living partnership, and the partnership had to be renewed. Again and again. There was another reason she could remain without disappearing. Jimmy eventually learned that Rosalynn was not simply his wife. She was an advisor, a political strategist, a person with her own causes, her own opinions, her own influence. And when he became president, that influence became visible. She was sometimes criticized for having too much access. Critics wondered whether she had too much influence over the president. But that criticism also revealed something about the marriage. Rosalynn had not entered the White House intending to become invisible. She had already spent decades becoming his partner. Why would that suddenly stop at the presidential gate? She continued working. Mental health became one of her major causes. She traveled, she spoke, she advocated, she used the platform, and Jimmy Carter allowed her to do it. That mattered, because a marriage can survive disagreement more easily when both people still have room to be themselves. Rosalynn's identity did not disappear into Jimmy Carter's. It expanded beside it. And then came 1981. The presidency ended. The Carters returned to Georgia. For many political couples, that might have been the end of the partnership. But for Jimmy and Rosalynn, it became the beginning of another one. They created the Carter Center. They worked together on international conflicts, human rights, disease prevention, election monitoring, peace efforts, mental health. The presidency had been one chapter. The partnership continued. This is perhaps the strongest evidence against the idea that Rosalynn stayed because she was trapped. If she had merely endured the marriage, the post-presidential years would have looked different. Instead, she continued choosing the partnership, and Jimmy continued seeking her participation. Their lives became intertwined with work that neither could have accomplished in exactly the same way alone. The marriage became an institution, but not an institution in the cold political sense, a working institution. Two people with different personalities and different strengths repeatedly putting those strengths toward the same goal. That does not mean the conflicts disappeared. They didn't. Even late in life, they admitted that they still had disagreements, but they had developed rituals for surviving them. That may be the real secret. Not avoiding conflict, containing it. Not pretending anger doesn't exist, giving anger an ending. Not expecting the other person to be perfect, expecting both people to return. There is a powerful moment in Jimmy Carter's later reflections on marriage. He explained that at the end of the day, he and Rosalynn tried to reconcile their differences. They would make up. They would kiss before going to sleep. They would read the Bible together. It was a routine. But routines become powerful when repeated for decades. Because a marriage is not made from its anniversary photographs. It is made from ordinary nights. The nights when one person is angry. The nights when another person feels misunderstood. The nights when neither wants to apologize first. The nights when silence would be easier. And yet someone speaks. Someone reaches across the distance. Someone says, in effect, "We are not finished." That may have been Rosalynn Carter's greatest refusal. Not simply refusing divorce, refusing finality. She refused to let one bad chapter become the whole story. And that philosophy appeared elsewhere in her life. She became one of America's most prominent advocates for caregivers and mental health. She understood that people often become invisible when they are struggling. She worked to make those struggles visible. Perhaps that sensitivity also shaped the way she approached her own marriage. She knew people were complicated. She knew families were complicated. She knew suffering could exist alongside love. She knew that two contradictory things could be true at the same time. You can love someone and be angry with them. You can admire someone and disagree with them. You can want independence and still want partnership. You can believe a marriage is worth saving and still admit that it nearly broke. That complexity is exactly what makes the Carter marriage worth studying. Because it was never the fairy tale people sometimes imagine. It was more interesting than a fairy tale. It was negotiated. It was repaired. It was argued over. It was rebuilt. And sometimes it was held together by faith. Not just faith in God, faith in the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today. There is another detail that becomes important when you look at the beginning. Rosalynn had once said no to Jimmy. That first refusal is almost symbolic. She was not someone who simply surrendered to his wishes. She questioned. She hesitated. She made decisions. And when they married, she did not stop being that person. In fact, the longer the marriage lasted, the more clearly that personality emerged. Jimmy himself acknowledged that she became his equal. That is perhaps the most important answer to the title. Rosalynn did not stay because Jimmy was always right. She stayed because eventually the marriage gave both of them enough room to be wrong. That is different. A relationship built around one person's authority eventually becomes exhausting. A relationship built around partnership can survive mistakes because the person who made the mistake is not the entire relationship. Jimmy Carter could make a bad decision. Rosalynn could disagree. Rosalynn could make a decision Jimmy disliked. He could challenge her. They could argue. But neither argument had to destroy the whole structure. That is how they survived the moments when divorce became imaginable. They separated the problem from the person. The marriage was larger than the disagreement. Of course, that did not make everything easy. There were political pressures. There were public humiliations. There were moments when Jimmy's words created problems Rosalynn had to help manage. There were years when the country itself seemed to be turning against them. The presidency can destroy a private marriage because there is almost no privacy left. Every disagreement becomes political. Every expression becomes a photograph. Every mistake becomes a headline. And the First Lady is expected to stand beside the President regardless of what happened behind closed doors. Rosalynn had to learn how to live with that. But she also had something most First Ladies did not have. She had decades of experience with Jimmy before the presidency. She knew the man before the office. She knew his ambitions, his stubbornness, his faith, his insecurities, his strengths, his weaknesses, and that knowledge gave her a perspective that no campaign advisor could possess. She was not merely managing an image, she was dealing with the person. That may explain why she could survive political storms that would have destroyed a less established partnership. The public knew President Carter. Rosalynn knew Jimmy. Those were not always the same person. And marriage lives in the second category. Not the public one, the private one. The man who comes home. The woman who is waiting. The argument nobody sees. The apology nobody photographs. The decision made at the kitchen table. That is where their real marriage existed. Not on the campaign trail. Not in the Oval Office. Not at the podium. At home. And home became the place where they had to solve the problems that politics could not solve. After the White House, their work together only intensified. They traveled internationally. They visited communities. They worked on peace. They confronted disease. They helped monitor elections. They advocated for people who were often ignored by governments. And they did it together. That matters because the story of their marriage eventually stopped being about whether Rosalynn had chosen Jimmy. It became about what the two of them chose to build. That is the difference between remaining married and building a marriage. Anyone can remain. Building requires participation, and Rosalynn participated, fully. She was not simply Mrs. Jimmy Carter. She became Rosalynn Carter, her own name, her own causes, her own legacy, her own institution, her own voice. And strangely enough, that independence may have been one of the reasons the marriage survived, because she did not have to destroy herself to remain with him. She could become more herself, and he could become more himself. That is what partnership can do when it works. It does not erase individuality. It gives individuality somewhere to live. By the time they reached their later decades, the couple had become almost inseparable in the public imagination. But the most revealing thing about their longevity is not the number. 70 years, 75 years, 77 years. Those numbers are impressive, but numbers can hide the actual work. A 70-year marriage does not mean 70 years without conflict. It means thousands of ordinary days, thousands of decisions, thousands of opportunities to leave, thousands of opportunities to stay. And somewhere inside those days, the choice kept being made. Stay, talk, pray, try again. That is why the moment of near divorce matters so much, because if you only study the ending, you might think the marriage was inevitable. It wasn't. There were points where another ending was possible. The marriage could have gone another way. Rosalynn could have decided that the differences were too great. Jimmy could have decided the same. They had already experienced enough conflict to know that love alone does not prevent damage. But they discovered something more useful than love alone. They discovered a method. They would fight. They would cool down. They would talk. They would seek reconciliation. They would pray. They would try again. It sounds almost boring, and that may be why it works. The great secret of their marriage was not a dramatic romantic gesture. It was repetition. The same small decision. Again, and again, and again, until 77 years had passed. Then there is the final chapter. Rosalynn Carter died on November 19, 2023, at the age of 96. Jimmy was still alive, still in hospice, still connected to the woman who had been beside him for most of his life. For decades, the two had shared almost everything: the farm, the campaigns, the presidency, the Carter Center, the arguments, the books, the travels, the faith, the family, the work, the ordinary life. And then suddenly, there was only one. The public image of their marriage became even more powerful after her death, because absence does something strange to history. It removes the ordinary moments. It leaves the legacy. People remember the photographs, the anniversary celebrations, the presidential years, the humanitarian work. But the real marriage had happened in much smaller places. In cars, in kitchens, in bedrooms, in offices, in arguments, in prayers, in conversations that nobody recorded. That is where Rosalynn Carter made her decision. Not once, but repeatedly. And maybe that is why the question, why did Rosalynn Carter refuse to divorce Jimmy Carter, needs one final adjustment. Perhaps she did not refuse divorce, in the dramatic sense people imagine. There was no famous moment when she stood before the world and declared that she would never leave. The historical record is more complicated. The Carters themselves acknowledged that there were periods when divorce came close to becoming real. The joint book disaster nearly pushed them there. They fought bitterly. They stopped speaking. They communicated through computers. And yet somehow, they found their way back. So the real mystery is not why she refused. It is why she kept returning. And the answer seems to be hidden in the entire architecture of her life. Rosalynn did not see marriage as obedience. She saw it as partnership. She did not believe disagreement meant failure. She believed disagreement had to be worked through. She did not need Jimmy to be perfect. She needed him to come back to the conversation. And she needed to be allowed to remain herself. That last part may be the most important. Because Rosalynn Carter did not disappear inside Jimmy Carter's story. She became part of the story as a force in her own right. She changed. He changed. The marriage changed. And when the original version of their relationship stopped working, they built another version. Then another. That may be the real reason the marriage survived. They did not spend 77 years preserving the same marriage. They spent 77 years rebuilding it. The young couple who married in planes in 1946 could not possibly have known what was coming. They could not have known about the farm, the governor's mansion, the presidential campaign, the White House, the humiliations, the political defeats, the Carter Center, the Nobel Peace Prize years, the humanitarian missions, the arguments, the books, the nearly broken marriage, the decades of old age they would eventually share. They were simply two young people beginning. And yet there was one thing they learned very early. Love was not enough. Love had to become work. Work had to become partnership. Partnership had to survive disagreement. And disagreement had to end somewhere. For the Carters, that somewhere was reconciliation. Not always quickly. Not always gracefully. Not always without anger. But eventually, they came back. And perhaps that is the most revealing image of Rosalynn Carter. Not the First Lady standing beside the President. Not the political strategist sitting in the White House. Not the activist addressing a national audience. But the woman who, after an argument, still believed there was a tomorrow. The woman who could be furious and still stay in the conversation. The woman who could disagree with her husband without believing that disagreement meant the end of the marriage. The woman who had once been so angry about returning to Georgia that she could barely speak to him, and who decades later would become his closest advisor. The woman who could sit across from him during a disastrous book project and nearly lose the marriage, yet somehow find a way back. That is not surrender. It is not weakness. And it is not the absence of conflict. It is something harder. It is the decision to repair, over and over, for decades. And maybe that is why the final lesson of Rosalynn Carter's marriage is not really about divorce at all. It is about what happens when two people stop asking, who is right, and start asking, how do we get back to each other? That question saved their marriage more than once. It saved it when Jimmy wanted to leave the Navy. It saved it when Rosalynn felt that her future had disappeared. It saved it when politics entered their home. It saved it when the presidency tested everything they had built. It saved it when a book turned two partners into enemies sitting at opposite ends of the same house. And when the word divorce finally became part of the conversation, it did not automatically become the conclusion. They got down on their knees. They prayed, and then they continued. That detail is easy to overlook, but it may contain the entire story, because Rosalynn Carter's decision was never simply, I will never leave. It was, we are not finished. There is a profound difference. One is a promise about the future. The other is a decision about the present. And marriages survive in the present. One day at a time. One disagreement at a time. One apology at a time. One night at a time. One return at a time. Rosalynn Carter did not know in 1946 that she would spend more than 77 years married to Jimmy Carter. She could not know that the boy who once asked her to marry him would become governor, president, and a global humanitarian. She could not know that their marriage would become one of the longest presidential marriages in American history. She could not know that they would eventually become symbols of partnership. But she knew something much smaller. She knew the man. And over the decades, she kept deciding that knowing him was worth the work. Jimmy Carter once said that marrying Rosalynn was the most important thing he had ever done. Coming from a man whose life included the presidency, international diplomacy, humanitarian work, books, business, and decades of public service, that sentence carries weight. Because he wasn't talking about an achievement. He was talking about a relationship. And Rosalynn's life suggests that she understood the relationship differently too. She did not stay because the marriage was easy. She stayed because it was meaningful. She did not stay because they never hurt each other. She stayed because they could recover. She did not stay because she had no voice. She stayed after finding her voice. She did not stay because she became less independent. She stayed while becoming more independent. And perhaps that is why the story still resonates. Because the marriage was never the story of a perfect couple. It was the story of two imperfect people who repeatedly refused to let imperfection have the final word. That is much harder and much more human. So go back to that moment when divorce entered the conversation. Imagine the alternative. One signature, one court hearing, one announcement, one final photograph. The Carter story could have ended there. Jimmy Carter would still have become president. Rosalynn Carter would still have become a major advocate. Their children would still have grown up. History would still have moved forward. But the partnership would have ended. Instead, they went back. They repaired. They continued. And eventually the years became so numerous that the original crisis disappeared beneath them. That is the strange mathematics of a long marriage. One terrible week can feel longer than 10 good years. One enormous argument can make the entire relationship seem broken. But if you survive it, the calendar keeps moving. Another birthday arrives, another Christmas, another anniversary, another campaign, another grandchild, another trip, another ordinary night, and suddenly the thing that almost ended the marriage is buried beneath decades of things that didn't. That may be the deepest answer of all. Rosalynn Carter didn't have to believe that every problem could be solved. She only had to believe that every problem did not have to become the ending. And she kept that belief. For 77 years. Until there was no next argument, no next campaign, no next book, no next morning to repair what had happened the night before. Only the legacy. And that legacy is not the image of a woman who endured everything. It is the image of a woman who learned how to become an equal inside a marriage that had once been unequal. A woman who found her own voice. A woman who built her own causes. A woman who challenged her husband. A woman who nearly lost the marriage. And a woman who chose again and again to find her way back. That is why Rosalynn Carter's story should not be remembered as, she refused to divorce Jimmy. The more revealing sentence is this. She refused to believe that a difficult marriage had to become a failed marriage. And that distinction explains everything. Because sometimes the strongest marriages are not the ones that never break. They are the ones where both people learn how to rebuild. Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn Carter spent more than 7 decades learning how. And in the end, the thing that held them together was not a photograph, not a presidential title, not a political alliance, not even the mythology of a perfect love story. It was a choice, repeated so many times that eventually nobody could count the individual choices anymore. Stay. Listen. Forgive. Return. Try again. And then do it tomorrow. That was the marriage. And perhaps that was Rosalynn Carter's greatest act of strength. She never needed to prove that she could leave. She had already proven that she could stand on her own. What she chose to prove instead was that two strong people could stand beside each other, even after the arguments, even after the disappointments, even after the moments when the marriage itself seemed uncertain. They could still return to the same table, the same home, the same faith, the same partnership, and begin again. Not because nothing had happened, but because everything had happened. And they still believed there was something worth saving.